It was adopted by nearly every nation in December 2000. Agreement is a legally binding international treaty to combat climate change. It was adopted by nearly every nation in December 2015 in Paris and entered into force in November 2016. The agreement aims to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from human activity that lead to global warming. The goal is to keep the global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 compared to pre-industrial levels, in order to prevent the catastrophic impacts of climate change, such as wildfires, flooding, and food and water insecurities. As part of the agreement, each country sets its own emission reduction targets and shares its action plan. And every 5 years, these contributions get reviewed to raise ambitions. The agreement also requires rich countries to help poorer nations by providing funding to adapt to climate change and switch to renewable energy.
The EU's Climate Change Service says that for the first time ever, average global temperatures have been more than 1.5 degrees Celsius hotter than in the pre-industrial era for an entire year. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is a key aim of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Breaching that mark, even temporarily, shows how difficult it is to achieve that goal.
Humanity has entered dangerous new territory. European scientists say the last 12 months were the hottest ever recorded, 1.52 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The unprecedented heat has helped fuel disasters around the world. Wildfires in Chile just this month were the deadliest the country has ever seen, with more than 130 people killed and hundreds more missing. In Canada, the last wildfire season was its most destructive in history, with an area larger than the size of Greece going up in smoke. Storms like those that soaked California earlier this month have also been worsened by the rising temperatures, according to scientists. These are the kind of impacts world leaders wanted to avoid when they signed the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. Then, nations agreed to try and limit warming to just 1.5 degrees, averaged over decades. For now, this key threshold has only been breached in 2023, but with the world sweltering under record heat and countries falling far short of emissions goals, last year may well soon become the new normal.
Well, for more, I'm joined in the studio here by DW Environment reporter Louise Osborne. Louise, we're looking here at an average temperature that's been at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial times or even higher during the past 12 months. That sounds alarming. Is it still possible to get back below that threshold in the coming years?
I mean, it's getting more and more difficult because we are getting closer to the target that was, or the limit that was set in place by world leaders and that has been recommended by scientists. But this is a temperature that is gauged over decades and not just 1 year. So 1 year at 1.5 does not mean that we've breached that limit. We're actually looking at temperatures of around 1.2 at the moment. But it is a stark reminder that if we keep going the way that we are going and we don't take action, we are quickly going to reach that limit and go over and experience the consequences that brings.
All indications are that the planet still is warming at this point. What would permanently exceeding 1.5 degrees, that threshold, mean for the planet's future?
I mean, we've already seen a taster of that, or we are at the moment, like the extreme weather events that we are seeing more and more of. Heat waves, for example, that are leading to droughts that we've seen in northeastern Spain, for example, that are worsening wildfires like those that we're seeing in Chile. It's also leading to heavier rainfall in some areas, leading to the severe flooding that we've seen last year in Greece and in Libya. And if we continue, then we will see more of those extreme weather events. That will affect our agriculture, obviously, our access then to food and water. It's likely to drive migration as people move away from areas most affected, and it's already leading to conflict in some areas of the world as well.
What are the main strategies that are being pursued now to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? Can we still do something about it?
We still have the possibility to stay below the 1.5 degrees that we've been talking about. Action needs to be taken quickly. World leaders in December at the Global Climate Summit said that they wanted to transition away from burning fossil fuels for our energy. They need to do that as quickly as possible, because then we can prevent the greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere that are leading to this warming. We also need to look at protecting our carbon sinks, forests, preventing deforestation, and we also need to think about providing money for areas of the world, the poorer areas that have done very little to contribute to climate change but are feeling the worst impacts, making sure that there are early warning systems in place, for example, to help people to make sure that they are not so heavily affected, and also making sure that they have the infrastructure in place that can cope with the changes that we're seeing.
Louise, thank you very much. That was DW's Louise Osborne from our Environment Unit.
Across the West leave a wake of destruction.
I have not personally seen a fire grow so fast in such a short amount of time
and cause dangerous air pollution levels to spike nationwide. The Colorado River, a vital resource for millions of Americans, faces overuse and drought fueled by climate change.
We are using about 20% more water than the river is delivering on the average. The reservoirs are going dry.
And as the world's best athletes compete at the Olympics in Paris, a heat wave sparks concerns for athletes and spectators alike. We look at how climate change could affect the future of sports globally.
Children are not going to be able to play baseball outside. People are not going to be able to play tennis outside. Something's got to give.
Welcome to PBS News Weekly. I'm William Brangham. In this episode, we're turning our attention back to climate change and how it intensifies extreme weather, causing devastation across the planet. This week alone, landslides triggered by torrential rains in southern India have killed at least 150 people. Heavy rains in Vermont crushed vehicles, caved in roads, and swept away homes. And out west, wildfires are raging.
This is the view for firefighters on the front lines of California's Park Fire. The blaze, believed to be started by a local man's burning car, is now the 5th largest in state history.
I have not personally seen a fire grow so fast in such a short amount of time.
In just a week, nearly 400,000 acres burned across 4 counties, forcing thousands of evacuations and destroying hundreds of structures. In rural Cohasset, California, Dave Tejan and his son Jonathan are both members of the county fire department. While they battled to protect their town, their own homes were lost to the flames.
I feel luckier than some of the people here because we do have a few things, not very much, but a few things to hold in our hands that survived. The friends from that I've known for so many years have just stepped up and shown so much support. You know, I feel rich in that.
Christy and Michael Deneau also live in Cohasset. They lost their house to another fast-moving fire 6 years ago in Paradise, California. Now, this is all that remains of the home where they rebuilt their lives. They had no fire insurance.
The most important things I grabbed was me and my brother and sister have my mom's ashes along with my dad. And so I was able to grab a few little pictures and her ashes.
The Park Fire's explosive expansion is nearly unprecedented, says UCLA climate scientist Daniel Swain.
This is definitely a top-tier event in terms of how quickly it moved across the landscape in those initial days. Some of the fastest rates of spread over that initial 24 to 48 hour period that we've seen on a wildfire in this part of the world.
Nearly 100 fires are currently burning across the West, and 4.5 million acres have already burned this year, about 1 million above average. This week, multiple blazes broke out across Colorado's Front Range, killing at least one person and forcing residents to flee their homes near Denver. Governor Jared Polis has now activated the National Guard to assist with logistics. Meanwhile, in Oregon, crews are stretched thin, battling more than 30 separate fires.
I've lived here all my life and never seen it this way.
To make matters worse, another brutal heat wave is forecast to turn up the temperature this weekend, a dynamic that Swain says continues to drive the intensity of this year's fire season.
All of that extra heat, even following what was a relatively wet winter in some places, has really dried out the vegetation, in some cases to near record dry levels.
And that means there's plenty of fuel for the fires yet to burn. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
And as those fires burn across the West, they can impact the air that millions more people are breathing far beyond the burn zones. These fires also generate massive plumes of smoke, which carry tiny, dangerous particles. And that smoke spreads across a much larger region, covering huge swaths of North America all the way to the East Coast.
We think that living in a smaller city, or living particularly in farm country where I grew up, that you're protected from the effects of high particle levels. But unfortunately, with the wildfires, everyone is affected, either large city or small city.
Lauren Wold runs a lab at The Ohio State University that studies how those tiny airborne particles, they're known as PM 2.5, when breathed in, can harm human health.
They can actually pass through the lining, get into your bloodstream, and then affect your heart, your lungs, your brain, any organ system. On days when PM levels are high, particularly during the wildfires, for example, that there is a significant increase in the amount of patients who are going to emergency rooms for things like sudden cardiac events.
Wold's research indicates that not only do these negative health impacts last long after the air is cleared, but in studies with pregnant mice exposed to contaminated air, their offspring were also seriously harmed by the smoky air. So mice that are in utero, that they themselves are not breathing contaminated air, their mothers are, that passes to them and then lasts for those baby mice for a good chunk of their own lifetime?
Yeah, correct. Once it's in the bloodstream, it can get into the maternal and fetal circulation and have effects on the offspring. And not only does it have cardiac effects, but it also has we've shown that it predisposes animals to development of a neurocognitive phenotype similar to an Alzheimer's disease animal.
One recent study showed that exposure to smoke-filled air can also shorten a person's life. It estimated that between 2008 and 2018, wildfire smoke in California was responsible for over 50,000 premature deaths, equating to an economic impact of over $400 billion. Anthony Wexler directs the Air Quality Research Center at the University of California, Davis. He wasn't involved in this study, but says this is further evidence of how climate change is impacting human health.
Climate change is changing everything about the weather patterns that we're used to. Wildfire smoke emits a lot of PM 2.5, and so just extending those correlations, the higher the concentration, the more people will die from heart attack. And the wildfire smoke makes a lot of this PM 2.5, and so we're going to see excess deaths.
So how do you know if the air you're breathing today is risky? Researchers measure that using what's called the AQI, or Air Quality Index. The higher the number, the more dangerous the air.
50% or so of the U.S. is under unsafe levels. And the scary part is that those with sensitive conditions, as well as the elderly or the very young, the levels are actually different. So, 100 is not considered safe for those individuals.
That's a huge number of Americans today breathing this dangerous air.
It is. It's very scary.
Researchers say limiting the time spent outdoors, wearing a mask when you can't, and making sure air conditioning and heating systems have high-quality filters can all help. But until these massive fires are brought under control, the air that many Americans are currently breathing will continue to be a threat. And we shift now from fire to water. The Colorado River provides water for 40 million people, but that critical resource is in jeopardy because of overuse, waste, and a historic drought increasingly driven by climate change. PBS News science correspondent Miles O'Brien recently looked at the many challenges facing the Colorado River Basin. Miles talked with former Arizona Governor and Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt. That was part of a PBS News special called Tipping Point, Colorado River Reckoning.
Who owns the Colorado River?
The United States of America owns the Colorado River. But the answer is not that simple. We are in a federal system in which the states take the position that they own the underlying rights and they are allocated out according to state law. And that all worked fine when there was enough water. The states are now at each other's throats saying, hey, we got to recarve this pie, but they can't agree on how to do it, and we've got the makings of a genuine water war.
A water war?
That phrase is tossed around a lot, but this one is real because the impasse is going to lead into a real dilemma where who's going to decide who gets how much water.
Is there any question that some entity or multiple entities are going to have to live with less water?
Well, of course, that's the underlying fact. We are using about 20% more water than the river is delivering on the average. The reservoirs are going dry. We've got to find a way to reduce water deliveries somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% on the best assumptions that the scientists can make. And the question is, whose ox is gored? Who is going to get cut? And in the absence of rules as they expire, you can say it's going to be Armageddon on the river.
It sounds like anarchy a little bit.
Yeah, anarchy is a better description because nobody wants to give up their water, and everybody is going to suffer to some degree. And we haven't been able to rise to the occasion because for 100 years we've been operating on false assumptions about how much water there is, and when there's a lot of water, it's easy to compromise disputes as they come up. That time is over.
Does a strict seniority system work in a world with diminishing water and increasing demand?
Well, more than half of the Colorado River water that belongs to Arizona is growing alfalfa down in the desert. Phoenix is way down the line because the population didn't start to really boom until the last 50 years. So Phoenix is looking up all of those vast fields of alfalfa saying, is this really a good way to allocate water? Farmers are saying, sorry, we were here first. Tough luck.
There must be a way to cajole or convince farmers perhaps to plant less thirsty crops or come up with ways to compensate them for using less. Is that kind of a third rail issue in your part of the world?
Well, it's a third rail issue, but inevitably there's going to have to be some reallocation, readjustment. I mean, the idea of an equitable allocation of water can't be based on what happened 100 years ago. And 5 million voters in Phoenix are ultimately going to say, third rail or not, we determine how water is allocated in Arizona. It's been an untouchable subject so far, but that's going to change. There has to be a readjustment, a reallocation between agriculture and the growing urban areas.
Governor, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Amid this critical debate over how to fairly use and distribute water across the Southwest, Miles looked at how some cities are getting creative with their water conservation.
When many people think of wasted water in the West, they think of this. The famous fountains at Bellagio on the Strip in Las Vegas. But the fountains and the lake are fed by an aquifer, and it's all recycled, conserving the municipal supply, which is piped in from Lake Mead. And Las Vegas has placed some big bets on water conservation. The city reclaims almost all of its water used indoors. It is treated and then either returned to Lake Mead or used for industry or irrigation of golf courses and public parks. The Southern Nevada Water Authority runs a Cash for Grass program, paying property owners who replace their thirsty lawns with water-efficient landscaping. This program has saved billions of gallons of water by removing millions of square feet of grass. The city strictly enforces watering schedules, encourages drip irrigation systems, fines violators that waste water, and uses smart meters to provide real-time data on usage. Las Vegas is a poster child for thrifty use of municipal water. Many other big cities in the West take a similar approach. In Denver, they run an award-winning campaign to encourage residents to be mindful of water use. They offer rebates for water-efficient appliances, fixtures, and irrigation equipment. They promote smart irrigation controllers, and they have incentives for people to replace traditional lawns with drought-resistant landscaping. The city treats and repurposes wastewater for uses such as irrigation and industrial processes. And Denver Water is testing the waters on a controversial but likely inevitable idea: direct potable reuse, treating wastewaters to a level safe for drinking and then piping it right back into people's homes.
Combating climate change principally involves us putting less greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is the gas that gets the most attention, but methane is actually much more potent at warming. While it doesn't last as long as CO2, when it's up there, it can be 28 times more effective at trapping heat. PBS News Weekend correspondent Ali Rogan recently looked at how Denmark is working on a unique and controversial approach to cutting methane.
Landfills, oil, and natural gas all contribute methane, but according to the United Nations, 32% of human-caused methane emissions come from livestock. Denmark's coalition government announced that they would introduce a first-of-its-kind annual tax on livestock greenhouse gas emissions. It amounts to about $100 per cow in an effort to curb climate change. Ben Lilliston is the Director of Rural Strategies and Climate Change at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Ben, thank you so much for being here. First of all, how big of a problem is methane, and does it get enough attention as it relates to the attention that seems to be put on carbon dioxide?
It's a huge problem. It's a huge challenge. It's also an opportunity to help us have a bigger impact on climate change faster. So methane is only in the atmosphere for around 12 years, and it is about 80 times the potency of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So as a result, if you reduce methane, you can get more near-term results and allow us to have a little longer of a window to reduce carbon dioxide emission.
And why do cows and other livestock produce so much methane?
Well, it's ruminants in particular, so cows and sheep, and it has to do with their stomachs. and how they work. They have multiple stomachs, and they belch out. Most of that methane is coming out of their belches. But they can also produce methane through their manure, depending on how their manure is stored. But in particular in the United States, but also in Denmark, as we're talking about, the cows themselves are a major source of methane.
And what do you see as the goal behind this tax that Denmark is putting in place? Is it to get farmers to reduce their herds? How does this tax lead to reduced methane emissions?
Yeah, well, they have multiple parts of this policy. So the tax is only one part of it. But yes, the biggest part of their agriculture sector is dairy and hog production. And so they are trying to address that head on, but they also have components of that policy that help farmers transition towards reforestation on their land, to help install wetlands, what they call peatlands in Europe, which are also major sources of greenhouse gas emissions when you drain those wetlands. And reforestation, of course, can help pull carbon dioxide out of the air. It's both helping farmers transition out of so much animal production. They're still going to produce a lot of animals and still produce meat and dairy, but maybe not as much, and maybe scale back and then have some of their land transition towards more climate beneficial land practices.
Ben Lilliston with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And finally, this week was can't-miss viewing for sports fans as the Olympics got underway in Paris. But amid all the competition, concerns grew over bacteria levels in the Seine River and a heat wave that blanketed much of France and forced some changes to the events. It shows that even the Olympic Games themselves are not immune to the impacts of climate change. PBS News arts and culture correspondent Jeffrey Brown explores how the changing climate is changing the world of sport.
The crack of the bat, a throw from the outfield. On hallowed ground in American sports, Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, New York, it's time for that great baseball tradition, the pregame warm-up. But these days, here as everywhere, warm-up means something much more.
Every professional sports community in the United States is being affected by climate change.
Alan Hershkowitz is the Environmental Science and Sustainability Advisor for the New York Yankees, the first environmental scientist hired by a pro team across all sports. At his urging, the Yankees became the first North American pro team to sign a United Nations pledge to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, because, he says, the stakes are too high.
So there is an urgency, because guess what? Children are not going to be able to play baseball outside. People are not going to be able to play tennis outside. Something's got to give.
The last 10 years have been the warmest ever recorded. It's pushed the globe into new and uncharted territory, and it's pushing sports to its limits.
The big issue with climate change, the one that's at the top of every sports scientist's mind right now, is heat.
Madeline Orr is a sports ecologist and author of a new book, Warming Up: How Climate Change is Changing Sport. She used baseball to highlight how rising temperatures have fueled the weather disasters that affect sports' bottom line. The powerful thunderstorms that cause rain delays. The churning hurricanes that have completely swamped ballparks. The massive wildfires that bring dystopian scenes and sometimes game postponements.
You'd be hard-pressed to find a facility manager who's not worried about storms and wildfire and heat and all these things. They know about it. For a very long time, though, the assumption has been, oh, it's a one-off. And that's really a dangerous assumption, because you'll clean up that mess and not necessarily put in place the adaptations that are going to help reduce the risks next time.
One player going to die and they're going to see.
Indeed, sports are trying to adapt, from implementing rest periods at the U.S. Open to help players cope with extreme heat, to holding the 2019 World Championship Marathon in Qatar at midnight to avoid unsafe temperatures. For baseball, one adaptation, roofs, taking fans not out to the ball game, but in. But experts, including Madeline Orr, note that adaptations only go so far.
On the winter side, it's essentially, are we going to have a season at all? That's the question. And it's because we're not getting as much snow, and where we are getting snow, it's just melting too fast. So the solution for 50 years has been, we will make snow artificially, and blow it out of these guns, but you can make snow all you want, and if it's not cold enough outside for the snow to stick on the ground, it's going to melt.
On the trails of Mount Bachelor in Bend, Oregon, Olympian cross-country skier Gus Schumacher is living that reality. He's not able to rely on snow that's been there in the past.
We've shifted our camp a little bit earlier just so we make sure we get on good snow.
We reach Schumacher as he trained for the Alpine Skiing World Cup and the next Winter Olympics. Conditions on this day, not bad. But that wasn't the case back in February when he raced in the American Birkebeiner in northern Wisconsin.
This year was my first year, and there was not a drop of snow on the entire length of trail from Cable to Hayward. Like, the actual trail was totally dry.
The warmest winter in 130 years reduced the 50-kilometer race to a man-made loop of entirely artificial snow.
Climate change has dramatically altered the conditions for winter sports, including Nordic skiing.
Schumacher has grown so concerned that earlier this year, he traded his ski gear for a suit and appeared on Capitol Hill with the advocacy group Protect Our Winters to share his experience.
Rising temperatures have led to shorter and more erratic winter seasons, with snow cover becoming increasingly unreliable.
We took the opportunity to say, these are the things that we can do to try to stay ahead of reducing our carbon footprint. So, big or small, we're turning over every stone.
Back at the ballpark, we met Doug Behar, Yankees Senior Vice President of Stadium Operations.
Natural cooling, you can feel the breeze come through.
He showed us some of the ways the Yankees are trying to mitigate climate change, not just adapt to it. Starting at the cavernous Great Hall, where fans enter the stadium. Constructed in an eco-friendly manner, it doesn't require air conditioning. Where cooling is required,
a little bit like being in the bottom of a ship or something. Yes.
A new water-based cooling system is much more energy efficient. Recycling and compost bins in every concourse, packaged food given away to shelters after every game. All of it leads to less electricity use and less food waste, which means fewer greenhouse gases that warm the planet.
90% of our environmental work the fans don't see because they relate to our equipment. They don't know that we're using LED lights that reduced our lighting emission by 60%. You know, a lot of it is invisible.
What's much more visible, Alan Hershkowitz says, is the influence sports and athletes have on millions.
Guess what? They learn from their sports organization. Sports loyalty is handed down generation to generation. Less than 20% of Americans regularly follow science. Over 80% regularly follow sports. The most influential role models are athletes. If athletes are selling cars, if they're endorsing banks, if they're selling pizza, why can't they sell environmental literacy?
The Yankees haven't won a championship since 2009, but they're off to a great start this year. Doug Behar sees plenty more to do on and off the field.
The Yankees are doing our best to try to stay ahead of the curve, lead where we can, and certainly do all the things that are necessary to be productive and responsible.
While winning championships.
Absolutely.
For PBS News Weekend, I'm Jeffrey Brown at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx.
And that's it for this week's episode of PBS.
Many people are working to halt climate change, but only with limited success. Why have climate researchers been unable to halt global warming?
I've been working in research for decades. I publish the scientific results, but that's achieved relatively little.
Why doesn't scientific data about climate change lead to action?
I guess I haven't been doing it right, or there's been a significant drop in global emissions.
Coal, oil, and gas continue to be used as fuel. Why?
The world would be very different if it weren't for the dirty deeds of the fossil fuel lobbyists.
Climate activists often end up on trial, but can their controversial tactics force change?
Of course there is resistance, but we might ultimately be successful.
But time is running out. Why is it taking the world so long to act?
We can't assume that just because society feels ethically compelled to save the world, it will. It's psychology, mindset, that determines whether it'll succeed or not.
Researcher Mojib Latif is trying to find the best way. How can we still save the planet?
Unbelievable. I've never seen anything like this before.
Climate scientists have been warning about global warming for decades, but their words have fallen on deaf ears.
Knowledge has failed to translate into action. We need to communicate the issues in a different, more emotional way.
Germany's last generation protest movement emerged in 2021. Co-founder Lea Bonacera went on a hunger strike, demanding a meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
I'm not sure you heard what I said. The fate of millions of people is at stake.
Millionen von Menschen. The young activists planned their first protests in this Berlin church. The group intensified its strategy after meeting with Chancellor Scholz. Their convictions are based on data provided by scientists such as Mojib Latif.
Cycling onto the runway, climate activists have occupied the Hamburg airport. Flight operations are paralyzed.
We can't stand by while our planet burns and the German government's obsession with fossil fuels stokes the fire.
I can't condone the tactics of the last generation movement. No one is above the law, even if their goals are worthy.
It's not that I want to anger people. I don't enjoy annoying them. But I've read the science, and I'm trying to figure out how this can work. Of course, it's stressful for people, for me too. And of course, the hate directed at us is horrible. I think the last generation is very focused on where we want to go, and we know that this method has often worked. Why shouldn't it work for us now?
When is protest effective? When does it do more harm than good? Questions that researchers have been exploring for decades.
There's a danger that protesters come across as missionaries, do-gooders, or know-it-alls. You have to be careful to strike the right tone and not make yourself out to be a savior of the world.
I believe scientists have a responsibility to step up and say, it can't go on like this, and even to go on strike as an act of resistance.
I think I would lose a lot of credibility if I did that. That's why I don't. Credibility is crucial. A lot of people listen to what I say. That's a huge asset, and I don't want to jeopardize it.
Meanwhile, the last generation activists are facing pressure, from raids to arrests and charges.
There are 13 charges against me from the first protests I did with Last Generation. Of course I'm upset by the prospect of going to jail.
It's a bit unfair. The people responsible for climate change aren't on trial.
Protest challenges people, society, politics, democracy. And of course there will be resistance, but we might ultimately achieve our goals.
We can't allow an environmental RAF to develop.
The last generation rejects anything to do with sabotage or even terrorism or violent damage to property.
Mashed potatoes and paint can always be wiped off. But even so, many see the young activists as anything but peaceful.
We are essentially radical, but not in our methods. No matter what happens, in terms of the last generation's strategy, we'll always be peaceful protesters because that's vital to a successful resistance.
The terrorism of the 1970s and 80s in Germany showed that you can't bring the state to its knees with violence. You can only lose.
Leah Bonacera has been sentenced to a fine of 1,800 euros by the Berlin District Court.
A fine is not a prison sentence. To be honest, I'm relieved. It would be completely disproportionate to send her to prison. I still think it's a bit counterproductive, because now there's a lot of talk about this form of protest, and less about the actual issue, which is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
An issue that's been debated since the 1980s. The media finally took up the story after scientists presented the evidence.
Altogether, this evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
James Henson gave the world a wake-up call and put the issue on the global political agenda. That Spiegel headline in 1986 was totally over the top, but in a way marked the beginning of the public discussion in Germany about climate change.
The Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The signatory countries agreed to prevent dangerous climate change.
I believe it is very important for Germany's reputation in the world, and even more so for future generations, that we see the writing on the wall.
As a young scientist, I was convinced that we had the data, the climate would be protected, and the problem solved. I would never have expected the massive backlash from lobby groups that ultimately prevented progress on climate protection, which is why emissions continue to rise to this day.
Founded in 1989, the Global Climate Coalition has been one of the biggest lobby groups. Corporations including Ford and Exxon spend millions promoting false information. For several years after its merger with Chrysler, Mercedes-Benz was part of the group, challenging the idea of human-induced climate change.
The management of Exxon, for example, financed advertorials in major U.S. newspapers such as the New York Times for years. These look like normal opinion pieces, but they're paid for. Exxon systematically spread false information. Exxon was up to date with the scientific research. Our studies showed that Exxon's projections were even more accurate. Social scientists have shown that hundreds of millions of dollars have been pumped in every year to lobby against climate protection measures, and obviously very successfully.
What happened with climate change was a bit like what happened with smoking. It was established that smoking is harmful to health, but then the smokers' lobby, the tobacco companies, started to set up fake institutes.
Angefangen, eben sogenannte Fake-Institute zu gründen.
The tobacco industry is on the defensive. It's a similar situation to 10 years ago when it was suggested that there is a link between smoking and lung cancer. The Royal College caused the shares of American tobacco companies to fall sharply in April '62.
Did the Royal College itself carry out any research investigations or
Hat das britische Ärztekollegium irgendwelche Forschungen durchgeführt und ist es zu irgendwelchen neuartigen Ergebnissen gekommen? Die Antwort ist nein.
Da wurden Menschen dann hingestellt.
People who had no idea about the issue made statements and acted as if they did, arguing against the evidence and sowing doubt, saying, well, it hasn't actually been proven that smoking is really harmful to health.
Wir haben das Problem For decades, large sectors of industry, the petroleum industry, the fossil fuel industry in general, have used false claims to attempt to save their business models. Spending millions on smear campaigns that undermine the credibility of scientists.
Wir können eigentlich so nicht mehr weitermachen.
We can't carry on like this. We can't expect self-restraint from industry. We have to get politicians to take deliberate and effective action. To repeat, the climate is like a runaway train. Even if you pull the emergency brake, the train won't stop immediately. It'll keep going for hundreds of meters. That's the situation we're in.
Und man muss ja auch sehen, dass sowohl
You have to realize that many people in business, in management positions, but also ordinary citizens, don't want to believe that climate change is happening.
dass nichts dran ist an dem Klimawandel. Das heißt, es
There's a huge market for excuses for doing nothing about it.
Ausreden beim Klimawandel nichts zu tun.
And these lobbyists serve that market with arguments that are all too readily repeated.
Argumenten, die dann allzu gerne eben aufgegriffen werden.
Are people unwilling to acknowledge things that require them to change their behavior?
My experience is that it's incredibly difficult to let go of habits. Lobbyists know that all too well.
Warum ist das so? To show why, let's look at a brain. You can see there are specific regions in the center of the brain that control our actions subconsciously, so to speak. There are two spheres, and this here is the basal ganglia. This controls subconscious activities. When we decide to take conscious action, that's up here at the front. Up here in the upper area is where the signals are sent from. But once this is automated, it happens subconsciously. You don't have to think about it anymore.
Why is this so difficult? Isn't change also built into the brain somewhere?
What we can do is overwrite a habit with a new habit. We have to identify actions or activities as a new habit, because we can't just switch off the old one. We have to decide what is a better alternative.
We're running out of time. We can't wait for new habits to become ingrained. How can we change now?
It would be nice if there was a button somewhere that we could just hit and the brain would change. Mobility behavior is a good example. It takes time to get used to new forms of movement. But once they're learned, they stay learned. The problem today is, whether it's lobby groups or the way we imagine the future, is that we stick to what we know and try to protect it.
Is this another reason why the expansion of renewable energies is stalling? After an initial boom in Germany, things began to go downhill around 2017. Laws prevented expansion, and companies left the country.
Legislation on renewable energies has been modified in such a way that the expansion has been massively hindered and has practically come to a standstill. We even saw an economics minister talking about how it was costing trillions. A claim he couldn't back up, and saying the energy transition was unaffordable. There was a whole PR campaign and all sorts of stories.
Proving the extent of the carbon lobby's power is difficult. But one example, over 600 lobbyists were officially accredited at the 2022 UN Climate Conference in Egypt.
More and more lobbyists are running around at climate conferences on behalf of industry. And then, what about the president of the 2023 Climate Conference?
The president of the 2023 Climate Conference is also the head of a huge oil company.
A conflict of interest in the fight against fossil fuels.
That's a no-go. It's unacceptable.
Wir wissen, dass die Energiequellen, die wir heute benutzen, weiterhin Teil unseres Energiemixes für die voraussehbare Zukunft bleiben.
Personally, I feel like the guy in Groundhog Day. Time and time again, the lobbyists show up and manage to get everything done their way.
Tatsächlich erfolgreich in ihrem Sinne alles Mögliche entscheiden lassen zu können.
This is really frightening.
The situation in the forest near Luptain remains tense.
Fires continue to rage in the dry forests near Luptain.
As someone who sits at a desk and makes computer simulations, actually seeing it is different.
The village of Kreuzrade was evacuated yesterday.
Climate change is causing more frequent extreme weather, including longer dry spells.
It's unbelievable what a fire can do. It's indescribable. I've never seen anything like it. Everything is destroyed.
It's the extremes that have changed. We either have extremely heavy rainfall, or, like right now, extremely long periods without rain. So we can definitely say yes, we are noticing climate change. We need to acknowledge the need for more investment in coming years to make sure we're okay.
The high cost of extreme weather due to climate change.
In the worst case, it could reach 900 billion euros by 2050.
Climate change is already costing a lot today, several billion euros a year for Germany. But this is just the beginning.
The forest fires in Canada continue to spread. Canada has launched an international appeal for help.
2 weeks of forest fires now flooding.
A biblical disaster.
It's the fourth night of heavy rainfall in Greece.
A state of emergency has been declared in the region.
Storm Daniel hit the east coast of Libya with full force at the weekend.
Authorities are expecting up to 20,000 deaths in the coastal town of Derna.
Cities and villages especially vulnerable to extreme weather may eventually have to be abandoned. Could a small town in Wales be the first in Europe? Fairborn, a village on the Irish Sea, has recently been making headlines across Europe. The sea level here could rise by as much as 30 centimeters by 2054. making Fairborn vulnerable to flooding from the sea, a nearby estuary, and river runoff flowing down from the hills. Is it already beyond saving?
2054, when the local authority have said that they are no longer spending money on the coastal defence if it breaches. Well, big changes have come along and you adapt. Some of that's painful, some of that you do swiftly and it's effortless.
The problem in this region is that these communities are on the coast, putting them at risk from rising sea levels. We'll eventually have to ask ourselves if it's always worth helping people adapt, if the worst can no longer be prevented. And the decision was made that in Fairborn, it's not.
Dass sie es zumindest in dem Ort Fairburn nicht machen möchte.
People are aware of the effects of climate change, but they're not doing much about it.
I keep telling people that we are running into big problems, okay, but nothing is really happening in terms of climate action. So why do you think nothing happens?
Probably because people don't believe it. They've got to see it to believe it, and slowly but surely they are awakening to what's going on. It's just like the village I live in. We're threatened by being flooded by the sea. They have come to look what they purchased, the houses they purchased that they were going to leave for their generations, for their children, were then spiralling down to being worthless. And that shook them right down to the roots. It shook everybody. You know, how can this happen to us?
I've got no car. I wash once a week. I shower once a week. I wash my hair once a fortnight. When I wash in the sink with my clothes, I save the water, and I use it for putting down the toilet.
Right.
And my wants are very few these days.
Yeah, and so this village will be given up. This is what
I don't believe. I'm optimistic. I think with all the clever people we've got in the country, they're bound to come up with some solution to this.
The authorities have since rowed back. Evacuating residents was never on the cards, despite what was said in the last 10 years. But if no more money is spent on coastal protection, the town is in danger of being flooded.
What do you do with 400 houses? 400 families? Every time we have a meeting, we talk to the council about this, and they haven't got an answer. And that is the most frustrating thing. To actually threaten to decommission your village and not know where you're going to put the people is sheer lunacy.
It's a lottery. There are the lucky ones who will be helped, and there are the less lucky ones who won't be. Another example that shows that when faced with the effects of climate change, humanity is helpless.
If the experts are right, Fairborn will one day be lost to the sea. That day is still a long way off, and that makes it hard for us to grasp. That's another reason why people don't act.
How do you see your future? Your future self in 10, 20, 30 years?
It doesn't look too bad.
The interesting thing is that you can see how you're changing, so you can relate to it. The question now is, what's happening in your brain? Do you have an emotional connection to this person? That's the interesting part.
That means I can see myself now as I might look in 20 years, but I still have no feeling at all for what that actually means.
That's it.
Do you have a sense of yourself? Or who is this person you see here?
He's completely alien to me.
And that's exactly my point. We've demonstrated what happens in the brain when we imagine the present and the future. This is a view of the brain from below. This is the back of the head. This is the frontal area. When you think about your present as you're standing here next to me, your brain creates a mental image of yourself. You have a sense of who you are. When you imagine being here in a week, a month, a year, then that changes. This frontal activity decreases. The brain creates an idea of the future. But you're a stranger in that future. This area is much less active. Your future self is a stranger to you.
So that means that because my future self is a stranger, I'm not affected by something that will happen in the future.
Me in 20 years' time is a complete stranger to my brain. That's why it's so easy to live without thinking about the future. It can't defend itself, and that's a problem when it comes to creating long-term change.
Long-term changes are exactly what the student movement Fridays for Future is fighting for. They want the world to act now to give young people a future worth living.
Greta Thunberg demonstrated in front of the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm for more climate protection. It soon became the global protest movement Fridays for Future.
People took to the streets in more than 200 cities in Germany today, calling for more action on climate change.
Friday spokesperson Clara de Vigneault is leading the demonstration.
Here's a picture of the demonstration, and here's the stage.
Fight for it! Are we gonna get it? So what do we want? Ich liebe euch. Danke.
What year was that?
That was 2021.
Fridays for
Future has become normal for many. It's our job to keep creating new momentum and saying, hey, there's a lot of us, and a lot of people behind us, and listen to us.
But have groups that take a tougher stance, like Last Generation, made Fridays for Future redundant.
I believe we can learn a lot from the anti-nuclear movement in Germany. We can apply some of its lessons, such as the interaction between a more moderate branch of the movement and a more offensive or militant branch. That's an important precondition, that they don't break apart, but at least roughly agree and coordinate. They can exist together, side by side.
Our main aim is to bring people together. Personally, I think it's good that other organizations get more attention. But we still manage to bring people together and show, hey, there's a lot of us across society.
These friendly, peaceful demonstrations inevitably fizzle out. They can't keep getting bigger. The peak was 1.4 million demonstrators in Germany. Then after that, before the pandemic, the numbers dropped significantly.
75% of Germans say that the Fridays for Future protests have had little or no impact on them.
Asked about the influence of Fridays for Future on their attitude towards climate change, 4% answered very strong, 19% strong, 35% less strong, and 40% not at all.
Und 40% mit gar nicht. The important thing is to see the fight against the climate crisis as a marathon. We've got to keep at it.
The climate activists say everything should already have been done. With other issues in the past, and I'd even include the anti-nuclear movement, there wasn't the same urgency. People, of course, wanted to get rid of nuclear power plants as fast as possible, but there weren't any tipping points. In 2, 3, or 5 years, this is a challenge for which there's no solution, no silver bullet.
I'd say Fridays for Future got the ball rolling. We managed to get climate protection laws passed. We made them happen in the first place. The Constitutional Court ruled on climate action. There are lots of examples of the climate movement bringing about change.
A victory for the climate activists. Their constitutional lawsuit was successful.
The Climate Protection Act is partially unconstitutional and must be amended.
In their quest to change popular opinion, Clara Duvigneau and Mojib Latif have been inspired by one of history's greatest natural scientists. Alexander von Humboldt gathered data from around the globe nearly 2 centuries ago. He was even the first to observe man-made climate change in Venezuela.
He clearly refers in his journals to the fact that all the smoke and fumes coming out of industrial chimneys would change the atmosphere, and predicts that this will have an impact.
We haven't actually learned anything. We just carry on destroying the forests. We destroy the environment in all sorts of ways. And somehow, we can't convince people to stop.
Scientists are expanding on Humboldt's work at Berlin's Botanic Garden. Researcher Jonas Zimmermann has collected and counted tiny diatoms in the Arctic Ocean, which are crucial for the entire Arctic ecosystem. The more diatoms there are, the healthier the water. But Zimmermann has documented their decline.
Diatoms lived on the underside of ice. They're a food source for krill, the crustaceans that whales and penguins feed on. But now that the glaciers are retreating, there's less krill, and less krill is leading to fewer whales.
Nowhere is climate change more evident than in the Arctic. Mojib Latif visited the region back in 2010.
I wanted to see for myself what was happening in the Arctic. I knew from my research that major changes were occurring. But it's not the same as actually seeing it, especially the glaciers. The vast loss of ice is breathtaking. In climatological terms, the ocean has various functions. On the one hand, it absorbs heat, which slows down global warming. But on the other, it also absorbs carbon dioxide, which humans release into the atmosphere. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's slowing down global warming, but the water is becoming acidic, and marine organisms are suffering as a result.
And tell me the number of personnel you're dropping off.
We're heading to the mesocosms, which are kind of huge test tubes that allow us to examine under realistic conditions what increased levels of CO2 are doing to organisms. We don't know exactly how the ecosystems react to ocean acidification. We're very excited to find out if long-term experiments produce the same results as the short-term ones. We learned a lot from these experiments. We can now develop computer models to project changes that will occur as a result of carbon uptake. We're now able to predict what will happen if we carry on as usual.
We've all been witnessing these dramatic developments for decades, including the automotive industry. But back in the early 1990s, Mercedes-Benz still described its latest super luxury S-Class as environmentally friendly.
Deshalb sind wir
We at Mercedes-Benz are proud to be setting new standards and pioneering new environmental technologies with our new S-Class.
Und hier neue Maßstäbe setzt.
To many, it was a clear-cut case of greenwashing. The new Mercedes-Benz S-Class was decried by environmental experts.
The S-Klasse
weighs around 2.2 times more than an average conventional car. The manufacturing process produces about 52 tons of waste, which is 2.2 times more than with an average car and amounts to about as much waste as 2 people in Germany produce in their entire lives.
So viel Abfall wie 2 Bundesbürger ihr gesamtes Leben lang produzieren.
We advertise our green credentials because we believe that we are making a great contribution and will continue to do so in the future.
Take the Mercedes S-Class. This really is scandalous in a country like ours. These cars are so heavy. The energy cost of powering them is truly appalling.
Die haben so eine Masse, die müssen erstmal bewegt werden und das kostet so eine Energie, das ist wirklich ein Skandal.
We haven't made any progress in the transportation sector, especially with automotive traffic. Cars have become bigger and bigger, and in cities where space is in short supply, SUVs are squeezing out everything else.
Dass die SUVs doch alle anderen verdrängen.
It was the largest S-Class ever made. People were annoyed because it was so wide it couldn't fit on car trains.
Okay. Das ist der kleinste SUV.
And this is one of the smallest SUVs on the market.
Eigentlich ein Kleinwagen.
The best-selling SUV in Germany is the T-Roc. If you do some research, you'll discover it weighs about 1,300 kilos, 1,500 kilos even. That's the same as a 1980s S-Class.
It's just as big if you look at them like this.
Slimmer, but 10 centimeters taller. And this car has worse aerodynamics than this one. If you add up how many SUVs are sold in Germany and how much they weigh compared to normal cars, we're talking an additional 750 million tons per year, or 500,000 VW Golfs.
Oder eben eine halbe Million VW Golfs.
What's so great about it?
Was die Leute faszinierend finden,
what people like is that it's taller. Almost 40% of cars in Germany are SUVs, and basically on the road you're elevated. But you can no longer see anyone else. You can't see children. Imagine that. A mother's at the wheel and here's a child.
You can't see it.
You could have 9 children in a row and only the 9th is visible. There's a heated discussion in America. There are even studies about child fatalities caused because drivers can't see when moving around when driving normally. 7,000 accidents and 200 deaths a year because people don't see these children. In an SUV, you sit higher than in a normal vehicle, and that gives people a sense of security and no doubt also of superiority.
I'm having déjà vu. When you compare the two cars, you can see we haven't made any progress in terms of environmental protection and resource conservation. And that's just not okay.
People who drive SUVs believe they've made an environmentally friendly choice because they've been manipulated into thinking that. You get into your SUV, you think, wow, it's a small car. I'm doing something good for the environment. I feel very comfortable. Of course you do. It's like an S-Class.
Maximum luxury with a clear conscience. That's the Mercedes promise. But environmentalists argue that the best choice is no cars at all. But wanting more is an instinct that's deeply anchored in our brains.
That's because the brain isn't set up for less, but for more, for maximization. Look what happens when we get more than we expected. Dopamine is released in the brain's happiness center, and we experience a kick, a rush, something positive and pleasurable. This maximizing is built into our brain. We experience it as a positive feeling. The opposite is experienced as dumb.
So that means climate protection needs to be fun.
Nobody saves the world because it's the ethical thing to do. You save the world if you have a clear benefit right now, and it makes sense in the long run. For example, if I want to buy organic, it has to be because that's cool now, not because it saves the world in 30 years' time. There has to be an immediate benefit. Then people will change their behavior.
Is that the problem with the energy transition? That people feel they're being burdened? And because they think renewables are costing them more, they aren't going along with it.
Affordability would be leverage. Instead, we try to solve problems in even more complicated ways and tell people to be ethical. We're completely unaware of the basics of human thinking. We want to maximize what we have. The trick now should be to combine this with a narrative about sustainability and sustainable products. Only then will we get somewhere.
Climate researcher Mojib Latif and most of his colleagues have been telling the world about global warming for decades, but to no avail. Now, young people are trying to stop climate change with various forms of protest, but it seems that most of us will only act if we can really see the benefits of protecting the environment. But if we don't, there will be no way of preventing climate catastrophe.